Delve. One. Abduction. My name is Ervin Costigan. I am, due to circumstances I will explain, being held captive in a city beneath the earth, somewhere in the wilderness west of the mountains. I will endeavor to record how I came here as best I can these next few days. Soon, I will make an attempt at escape, one I am almost certain will fail. But whether or not I see the light of the sun again, I mean to leave this hidden in the upper caverns as a warning to those men who might stumble into the dark in the future. I came here not knowing the risks that dwelt below. Let it not be said that I did not do everything in my power to ward off others from the same awful end. I am a son of Virginia. I was born to a well-off family of craftspeople near Richmond. My father, a master gunsmith and upscale metalworker, intended that I should go to school up the coast, or perhaps even in Europe. But much as I enjoyed the works of great naturalists and daydreamed about strange landscapes out west, strict schoolroom endeavors never took hold with me, and I was drawn to rougher and wilder work. A boyhood friend of mine, Hagen Longstreet, had spent a winter as a long hunter under the tutelage of his elder cousin Ance, and having done quite well for themselves off the back of hunting bison, elk, and deer in the untamed land beyond the mountains, they needed another hand for their coming trip. So it was that in the October of 1769, I set out with Hagen from Richmond, toting guns and trailing dogs on horseback, to the protests of my mother, who chased us down the lane as we went. There is more to be said, of course, about troubles at home and the drama involved in my departure, but it has been years, and too much has happened for me to dwell on it. Suffice it to say, I did not leave on the best of terms, and because of the danger inherent in the profession I'd chosen to pursue, I imagine my family back home assumes I've been killed west of Appalachia, whether by the elements or by Indians. Would that it had been so simple. Ants had gone ahead of us to stake out an autumn camp in the rugged Kentucky territory, so it was just Hagen and I on the road those first few weeks. I had dreamed for years of the freedom, risk, and excitement offered by the frontier, so often discussed by travelers back home. But the sheer Titan openness of the land didn't strike me until we were in the Appalachian Range. We crossed through the Cumberland Gap late in the month, and emerged into the lower hill country in early November, as the nights grew damp and cold. Other than two scattered crews of lean summer fur traders headed back east, a pair of Shawnee hunters who stopped to speak with Hagen in their own tongue along the road, and a single band of shifty-looking men we took to be prospective squatters who we overtook later down the route. We passed no one on the trail during all that time. Since the signs of town and farm died at the foot of the mountains, I felt as if we'd come into an abandoned and silent land. But it wasn't silent, not entirely. Black bear and elk crashed through the trees of lonely valleys at our passing, and the fiery autumn leaves of the Blue Ridge and outer mountains rustled with the lilting song of birds moving southward. We spied a mountain lion in the lower hills once, interrupting her as she dragged a deer along a rocky creek bed we'd come to cross in the yawning wilderland. She bolted for the trees at the barking of our dogs, but waited only long enough to be sure we were on our way, before creeping back into the red light of the coming dusk to finish her work. Above the shadows of prowling animals, the gurgling of streams, and the sweep of chill winds, we watched for the Indians who rule that country, and often glimpsed them as distant silhouettes, watching our passing from rocky ridges in the scant light of dawn. But close as we held our rifles, neither wildlife nor savages troubled us, and we made our quiet way into the low country without violence. Hagen told me this was regular. The Shawnee and Cherokee and others of their ilk were by now, he said, either too scared or too rich off the proceeds of trade to trouble with us. It was conflict over the buffalo herds of the lower plains and rolling hills of western Kentucky that posed a risk. Thus, as the forest became less dense and the Titan chestnuts gave way to equally ancient oaks in the low country, we ceased to burn fires in the cool night and kept the hunting dogs close and quiet on the road. This only exhilarated me further, the strangeness of my breathtaking surroundings combining with the unspoken danger of the expanse and unseen threats beyond the hills, to fill my heart with an excitement it had never known in the safety of bustling towns and walled settlements. I'd been so desperate for the freedom and exhilaration promised by the land west of the mountains that I'd told my parents I didn't care whether I returned or not. If I took an arrow to the throat my first day past the Cumberland Gap, then I'd have lived more in those scant hours than I'd ever have lived in decades spent toiling beneath a roof back home. This flirtation with danger only confirmed my boasts. I was alive out here, finally able to witness firsthand the flora and fauna I'd only read about in the books of naturalists. I was free, and damn the consequences. Perhaps, if Indians and wild country were all I had to worry over, I would still feel that way. Tensions grew as we went further and further west. Hagen would steer us so we'd hit little slipshod cabins and nascent farmsteads in the open country, where the poorest and most adventurous of the men back east had begun to stake their claims before their betters bought up the land privately. Most of these families he knew in passing from his prior excursion, and he asked after ants with them. Apparently, ants had been tasked with sending word of an exact location back to us via these scattered frontiersmen, and yet even as November grew long and a colder December loomed large, he had sent no instructions back for us. Hagen's mood grew dark, and, at length, as we entered the southwestern span of the Kentucky Territory, he began to share vague yet eerie details about the region we were headed for, which had troubled him since discovering the spot the previous winter. Despite the fact that buffalo had become rare in the western reaches of Kentucky Territory due to hunting by white traders and enterprising Indians looking to sell to isolated frontier forts, squatters in the mountains, and the cities back along the eastern coast, none of these hunters had quite cracked the spot Hagen and Ants had found yet. The valley we were headed for, an isolated lowland between two hilly, forested ridges that dwarfed the softly rolling hills and meadows of the surrounding country, was home to two large herds of the prized beasts, and a number of deer and smaller quarry besides. A band of Chickasaw seasonally camped and hunted nearby the spot, and because Hagen and Ants said they were enemies to the Shawnee, they'd done some trade and talking with the cousins the year prior. Once they'd learned the cousins had found the Misty Valley and meant to return the next season to hunt it in earnest, the Chickasaw had warned Ants, who'd learned a good deal of their speech, not to hunt or camp in the valley. They had said it was a trap, and that no man should walk in the shadows there, but became cagey when pressed for details on the matter. Moreover, though Ants had always brushed the warning off, Hagen remembered feeling uneasy there during their short scouting mission in. As we moved further and further west without hearing from Ants, Hagen's worries only grew, and though I had the feeling he didn't want to scare me needlessly by venting all of his worries to me, he shared enough that I grew wary of the place before ever I saw it. When we came into Chickasaw country proper, we were met by a group of 4 men who, though Hagen knew scant little Chickasaw speech and they knew little English, seemed to indicate they recognized Hagen and had seen ants. But the quartet of red men seemed uncertain about ants, glancing to one another and trying to conjure up words they did not know. When at length we turned for the valley, they tried in vain to wave us off. The language barrier did not allow them to tell us why, but as the afternoon drew on and we came into the shadow of the hills that marked the border of the vale, I found myself uncertain and truly frightened for the first time on our trip. We decided we would camp outside the valley on the grassland that first night, since sundown was already upon us. We would only cross in to find ants and whatever camp he'd set up in the light of dawn. But as Hagen shrouded our tethered horses and dogs with scrub he cut from the meadow to shield them from any unfriendly eyes, and the silent December night closed in about us without any hint of bug or bird song, my companion did not prepare for sleep. Instead, he insisted we take turns at watch. I asked if he suspected some trickery on the part of the Chickasaw, but this he denied. Rather, it was the slopes leading up to the valley we planned to hunt that Hagen kept his eye on as I wound down for rest. Once dark had truly fallen, and the winter haze of chill mist rose up off the myriad ponds and streams that broke the softly rolling hills, he finally told me what had been troubling him. He told me of things which had happened the prior year during their visit to the valley. He said his cousin had pulled a strange string of dark legendary from the Chickasaw on their first meeting, something about a rival tribe which dwelt in the stone. I've come to think this meant caves, something lost on all of us at the time. The Chickasaw said that many years ago, they had fought a fierce series of wars with this tribe of stone giants, and had eventually collapsed many of their living places, and sealed off their villages. But the valley, they said, was dark enough in the dead of night that the stone giants didn't fear to traverse it, and this had prevented the Chickasaw band from trapping their enemies there. It had become a sort of unhallowed ground to them, and though they had freely admitted the game was plentiful there, they had warned Hagen and Ants off hunting the place just as desperately during the first year's trip as they had this winter. Then, in the silence that fell after, Hagen told me they had spent but one night in the valley last year, and that he'd experienced something he'd long dismissed as imagination. He had always been prone to allowing his mind to play tricks on him out here in the open country beyond the Blue Ridge, he said. Part of the reason he'd been so eager to have me along with him to tail his cousin, so he wouldn't have to make the long ride alone. Sounds and distant motion itched at a man's mind out here, in all this open and beautifully empty land, making him doubt that he was alone even when he knew better. Last winter, during their single stop on the bountiful valley floor after a day spent observing the herds and scattered deer there, Hagen and Ants had made camp along the tree line much as we'd done that night. Ants, never one to waste an opportunity for sleep no matter the discomfort, was quick to bed and slept soundly till dawn. But Hagen was not so fortunate, and had awoken perhaps an hour before dawn at what he thought was a subdued sound of fear from one of their horses. Hagen told me he'd sat upright, looking off into the obscuring veil of shadow between the trees where the horses stood still and silent, uncharacteristically frozen for minutes as he watched. He felt fear, but unlike prior bouts of wilderland paranoia in lonely places, there was an edge to this fear, an edge that cut to the core of him as he shivered in the damp pre-dawn morning and made him certain he was being watched. Adding to this fear, the horses and dogs both would loose low and long vocalizations now and then, as if the beasts were desperate to voice their discomfort, but simultaneously petrified to draw more attention to themselves. At some point, After what felt like ages laying in uncomfortable silence debating whether to wake Ants as his eyes searched for purchase they could not find in the dark, dawn slowly broke somewhere past the treetops and painted the sky a deep, tentative blue. A crashing came from the trees as an unseen form fled for the deeper woods, and at once Hagen was certain whatever made it had moved on 2 legs. The horses cried and the dogs yowled, but the usually fierce hounds gave no chase. Ants, awakened by the commotion, asked his cousin what had happened, but shrugged off Hagen's worries when a brief search showed no sign of Indians. During their long and uneventful trip back home, Hagen had convinced himself it had been a deer, or maybe a large wolf, scoping them out before being startled in the dark. He told himself that his own imagination had been to blame. But now, with Ants having been quiet for weeks, the uninterpreted warnings of the Chickasaw fresh on our minds, and the dead quiet of the woods around the valley closing in to surround us, he'd begun to wonder once more. I agreed to sit watch for him, and wake him up in a few hours to take his own. The animals, while still, seemed on edge, and when at last Hagen did manage sleep, and I found myself alone, the quiet became agonizing. Once in a while, the wind would shake the bald branches about us, or the distant yipping of coyotes or howling of wolves would roll out to my ears from somewhere amidst the outer dark. But all that murk and mist that choked the dreary land about us was, for the most part, wholly silent. Sometime past midnight, judging by the moon that sometimes peeked down from the overcast sky, I thought I noticed the horses shift and shuffle uneasily across the way. I walked out to them and scanned the clearing nearby, but saw nothing. The trees leading uphill towards the ridge in the eerie valley beyond were so veiled with blackness that nothing could be seen there, and at length, after many tense moments of fruitless listening, I returned to my perch and rode out the rest of my watch in alert and twitchy stillness. I woke Hagen not terribly long afterward for his shift. He took it without complaint, only asking whether I'd seen or heard anything strange. I told him the horses had perked up some time ago, but I'd not caught anything afterward. He nodded, silent and stalwart as ever, and shook off his weariness for his watch. The sun rose without incident. We broke our modest camp and pushed up the steep hills while the frost still made the mud and slopes firm enough to pass unfettered, and came at last to the ridgeline around the hated valley. In the morning light, it was almost heavenly, wreathed in mist so dense it seemed as if we looked down upon clouds from above, with the half-glimpsed glitter of crystal dancing on the cold-kissed grass and scrub beneath. Though they could not be seen, the distant crunch of bison on frosty ground and the nasal vocals of elk came to our ears. With the light of day on us, the occasional chirp or chatter of winter birds was heard. The beauty of that contained vista was almost enough to make us forget the tension of the night which preceded it. But we did not forget. Hagen fired his weapon into the air, and I followed suit, the agreed signal to Ants that we'd found the valley. But there came no reply, and after a brief moment of wary silence, the beasts below the mists went back to their accustomed clamor. We scoured the valley for him, our efforts only picking up as noon neared and the mists cleared. We found traces of several fires along the outskirts of meadows on the valley floor, all of them hugging the banks of a large creek that broke the center. Horse droppings and the spoor of hunting dogs helped our own canines stick to a relatively steady trail, but despite our pace and the continued firing of rifles here and there along the way as signal, we heard no beckoning shots in reply, and saw no trace beyond prints. In the middle afternoon, Hagen, perhaps stricken with the intuition of a relative, ducked into a dense string of pines along a runoff stream that fed the main creek. It was thick enough that the boughs blotted out most of the sun and ate up any chill wind, but the branches were far up enough that the 4 or 5 feet of clearance allowed for room to bed down. They were arranged in a circle, and the gap in the center of the trees hosted spent embers which, when turned, still smoked with the heat of a recent fire. It seemed the perfect camp. Shielded from the elements, one was also invisible from the outside the moment they ducked in. Hagen thought the fire must be no more than 2 nights old, but the camp had been slept in for more than a couple nights. The limbs of several pines had been cut off and piled to make a spongy bed of brush upon the ground, and overhead, a treated hide had been pulled taut as a lean-to tent to fight back the worst of any winter rain. Rough cookware was scattered around the ashes, all of it unclean and collecting moisture from days left to gather the cold morning dew. One of our dogs, rooting around in the blanket of fallen needles near one of the tree trunks, nosed out a lump of flesh which, on closer inspection, turned out to be the ear of one of Ance's hounds. There was also a large, furry patch of skin outside the camp, amidst several great smears of mud and blood, perhaps part of the flank of Ance's lone horse. We knew then that something dark had happened here, but Hagen could not so easily give up the search, and I shared the sentiment. And so we rode on, following our dogs in the larger creek. We discovered no more fires and found no more horse tracks, but we did find boot prints about a mile from the pine camp, down low in the mud along the bank, as if the wearer had stooped low to drink. We kept our rifles close at hand and primed, and we kept our voices hushed. There was no talk of why, or speculation about possible explanations. We just knew it was better to tread lightly and be ready. But when the sun began to sink, and the shadows grew long, and still no concrete sign of ants had surfaced, Hagen suggested we make haste for the ridge and camp outside the valley again. He got no argument from me, and we made a speedy retreat over the nearest hills. We pitched camp subtly, as we'd done the night prior, this time even more wary of how visible we might be from afar. After a long and quiet meal of cold meat, I took the first watch again. Though it passed without visible incident, the silence was accompanied once more by the chill certainty that I was not alone with Hagen in the dark out there, and that the uncharacteristically twitchy and demure mood of the dogs was not coincidence. I watched the trees towards the hills this time, ignoring the rolling grassland we'd crossed to find the place. Whatever the Chickasaw feared, whatever had attacked ants, had come from the vale. Again Hagen rose to take my watch, though I noticed he'd slept not a wink in the time allotted to him. He insisted he was fit to do the job, and I turned in. Now, I cannot be certain what happened after this, in the hours before dawn. Despite my nerves, I was exhausted from the long night and the longer journey, and I fell into a deep and weary sleep almost immediately. When I did wake, everything happened so fast and in such total darkness that I did not grasp what was actually going on. Hagen was the only one who really experienced what was to come, and for reasons that will become evident later, he did not have much time to communicate his experience to me. Still, I will write it out as best I can, in hopes any good men who stumble on this might be able to piece together what happened and where we were taken on that last night I spent beneath the stars. Hagen was, by his account, keenly aware of a similar sensation of being watched before long had passed. He patrolled the perimeter of our area, sticking to the most open parts of brush, and remained alert to any whining among our animals. He stared out into the dark for some time, trying to make out shapes he thought he saw dancing between the tree trunks. Then, all at once, he was stricken senseless by some projectile hurled from the dark, a stone or perhaps a hunk of sodden wood. There was a baying and squealing as the dogs were attacked. and one of the horses broke free and bolted screaming into the night while the other fought its binds in vain. In a fumbling daze, he fired his rifle, which he kept primed for the purpose, and the spark of the blind blast he threw into the woods along the slope up towards the valley ridge revealed dozens of pairs of eyes surging forth from the dark. I awoke amidst the clamor, but I have no memory of moving to rise. I seemed already to have been swept up in a great pair of iron-strong hands, with one tight about my throat and one pinning my legs together, carrying me overhead like an ape loping with a trophy. Any blind flailing or prying at long, tapering fingers I did was fruitless, and I was hauled off like a thrashing child through the blackness of the woods, with Hagen coming close behind. The wiry giants which carried us moved too quickly and stuck too deep to the shadow for me to get a good look at them in the chaos, but the pack moved with the silent precision of wild animals through the pitch darkness. I heard the fading shrieks as our animals were slaughtered, bare-handed, I'd guess, based on what I'd later see of the cave things. Before long, we were perhaps a mile off, over the ridge and into the Forbidden Valley, where the pale giant's bare skin glinted with the moisture of the cold night, as they lurched through moonlit meadows and scrambled through brush and branches that bit at my cheeks and limbs in the dark. I didn't have time to dwell on the demoniac insanity of it, those half-glimpsed ghosts from the dark making off with us like wild game. I had less than 5 minutes, I'd guess, from abduction to our arrival at that awful crack in the earth. As has been the case thus far, I saw little in the dark of the night, and I cannot describe what exactly the entrance to the cave looked like. It was in some of the densest woodland in the valley, and was so small only one of the giants could shimmy through at a time, with Hagen and I being dragged in after them by the legs like two captured winter hares, both too breathless and bruised by the brief journey to struggle or yell in the moment. They began their descent, the plummet into the bowels, into hell. Indeed, given the half-seen nature of our abductors and their almost preternatural speed and coordination in the dark, I mused more and more that we were actually being hauled hellward by imps or demons vomited forth from the pit itself. The chill of winter fast abated, and the warmth of inner earth, with which I've become so familiar over time, swept in to embrace us, lending credence to my darkest imaginings. Time clogged in the mind during that long trip down, with hour after sightless hour spent without sensation save for the alien chatter of the things, as they clicked and whistled low to one another in the blackness, or the soft shuffle of them as their warband felt its way down familiar chutes and slid with practiced grace between stony jams and clustered stalagmites in the murk. The trickle of water sometimes swelled to a gurgle, and after being dragged through the chill water once or twice as my carrier crouched low to navigate a cramped tunnel blind, I came to realize we were following a stream as it wound its way ever downward into the deeps of the stone. Occasionally we would come into a large chamber, and the clacking vocalizations of the hunters that carried us would echo like voices in an empty theater. Far more commonly, we would spend sightless ages being dragged in narrow tunnels too small for our captors to pass upright or crouched, our clothing torn to ribbons and our skin gouged and scuffed on unforgiving edges as we were slid unceremoniously across the rocks. We would be lowered down like rag dolls from hand to hand as our captors scurried ape-like down rough shafts in the ground, the slick slides never seeming to slow the giants. Roaring waterfalls sang their songs in great vistas lost to my eyes even as we passed through them, and eerie bug song whispered down passages so tight I had to hold my breath to fit through them as we went, making me marvel at the flexibility and agile grace the things that carried us must have. It went on long enough that I grew weak with thirst, and began lapping up water from the stream we trailed like a dog each time the thing's path took me through the chill water. The taste clear as crystal, and shot through with the silt of sediment so fine it could hardly be detected. I considered attempting escape in some way, as I'm sure Hagen must have done, but the utterly unnavigable nature of my environment meant that even if I did slip free in sudden struggle, my captors would find me, and perhaps punish me. Small insects often scurried upon my skin, something I felt more and more as the jagged edges of stone tore more and more of my clothing away. I had time to wonder whether I should begin to snatch and eat these as hunger began to gnaw at me. Through it all, so far as I could hear, our captors never slowed and never hesitated. They never ate and they never drank. They never slept and they never paused to reassess the path before them in the all-consuming gloom. By the time, unbeknownst to me, we'd neared the end of the journey, I'd entirely given myself over to the idea that the things were unnatural, and with perhaps more than a day having been spent on the move, I toyed with the idea that this was some hell all its own, that I would be suspended there among unseen monsters in unfriendly surroundings, in torment, forever. But around the moment I began to weigh my mortal sins and moral shortcomings to attempt to determine what had landed me such a punishment, I gradually realized the things which carried us had grown agitated or animated, their strange speech rapid and sudden, as one barked to the other through the dark. There was a rustling and jostling amongst the monsters, and I heard a startled yelp from Hagen up ahead of me, the first noise other than muffled groans or gasps I'd heard from him in all this time. I struggled then, expecting the worst, my beastly instinct to survive overpowering any logical realization there could be no escape in my circumstances. But I was not stricken or slain. I was merely dropped casually into a slick-sided, sloped tunnel. I slid down without time to do more than kick and flail at slippery walls which gave me little purchase. I sprawled on damp stone when I at last came to a halt, and found I had bumped up against Hagen in the dark. Ours were the only sounds I heard in that moment, and I reached out and found his shoulder in the blackness. He told me in a whisper so soft I strained to hear it to open my eyes, and, only then realizing they were casually shut against the strain of so long spent looking for light where there was none, I obeyed. We crouched then in a big room of mossy stone, shot through with hanging stalactites and rising stalagmites that made the room feel like a great green predator's mouth. The giants had not followed us down. We both struggled to stand on the moss of the chamber, for it shifted like damp leaves over mud beneath our worn boots. There was a flickering, ambient glow by which we saw, a candle burning upon the bare floor across the room, I realized, and I had to catch my breath when I registered sluggish and cautious movement stirring around it. Hagen was faster than I reorienting himself. The pain of even so minor a light after so very long spent blind had left my head spinning. I don't know how Hagen determined the vague figures around the candle's glare were not yet more of our captors so quickly, but he did so, and cried the name of his cousin, leading me to follow him over and lean, eyes shielded, over the glare of the candle. Ance looked even worse than Hagen and I must have looked. His scalp was split in several places, and his face was streaked with long-dried blood. His body, nude save a makeshift wrap of dirtied cloth, was blue with bruised flesh as often as it was pale with the terror of the moment. His teeth were half missing, and one of his eyes was still swollen shut. He lay despondent amongst several other equally disheveled men, all of these strangers to me, red Indians of one tribe or another, the entire group looking as if all traces of hope had departed them. But Hagen's voice stirred him, and after a groggy moment spent confirming this was no dream, Ance told us in tones made ragged by strife the story of how he'd come to be there. He'd lasted far longer in the valley than we had, several weeks in fact. But eventually, the stirrings of things unseen in still forests alerted him to watchers in the night. An early snow had fallen perhaps 6 days prior to our arrival, and in the stark white of the blanketed valley, he had found bare footprints he deemed too large to be a man's, and had spotted lean silhouettes ducking back behind trees near dusk, their frames outlined plainly against the blaring gleam of the frozen woodland. Even amidst all the strangeness, Ance had apparently convinced himself for the first few nights it was just rival hunters looking to scare him off a good piece of land. But eventually, the cave things had grown bold and had begun calling to one another around the camp through the night, sometimes mimicking his frustrated shouts into the dark. At first, he built fires to keep them at bay, for the things balked at bright light. But eventually, this had ceased to work, and their glimmering eyes betrayed them as no ordinary men. Ance had made a break for the outside just a handful of days prior, but they had taken him during his flight in the half-light of late dawn. Hagen recounted our story in turn, allowing me to hear his half of our abduction for the first time. We three figured that Hagen and I had been snatched perhaps only 3 nights after Ance. But in those intervening days, Ance had learned much, and he began to babble it out like a madman desperate for an audience. Indeed, had our circumstances not themselves been so insane, I would have struggled to believe him. But Ance was never an imaginative man, and his eyes spoke nothing of madness, only of fear. He told us in hushed but frantic tones that the things that had brought us here were looking for information of some kind. They had cities and territories down here, he said, and the group which had captured us was some kind of raiding party, sent forth by one of these undercities many days' travel to the west. They sought information about the eastern mountains, Appalachia, Ance speculated, and a once-allied series of cities beneath it, with which they were now at war. These eastern cities of cave things had fallen into strange habits of worship, at least by the standards of the cave things, and the war which had recently broken out was blamed primarily on this religious conversion. All these concepts of underground cities and subterranean geographies were alien to me then, but if I held any doubt to how true it all was, time would strip those doubts from me. But in the moment, I must have been dumbstruck, speechless while Ance babbled of things for which my blessedly sheltered mind had no frame of reference. Our abductors were in doubt over whether the surface folk, as they called us, had also fallen into these strange ways of worship, and had been snatching as many human beings from beneath the stars as they could in order to determine whether we too were tainted, as they put it. They would interrogate the 2 of us soon, he guessed. Ance urged us to play along and to do as we were asked, for dissent and resistance were not tolerated among the pale giants. But as his desperate tirade came to a gradual end, Ance trailed off and locked eyes with me in the dark. An even keener pallor came over him then. He asked Hagen whether he'd taught me any Indian tongues on the way out here, and seemed doubly shaken when Hagen answered that he hadn't. Ance shook his head, muttering to himself, more indistinct sounds of hopeless woe than any distinct words. Eventually he spoke. The Indians we'd found with Ance were apparently from varied bands spread across the banks of the Ohio and the western reaches of Appalachia, but all of them spoke dialects of either the Cherokee, Shawnee, or Chickasaw languages. These were the languages with which the cave things were familiar. Ance went on to say that 2 French trappers from west of the river had been brought in the same day as him, and both had been brained with stone clubs the moment it was revealed they knew nothing but French, and had not been through Appalachia to arrive in the region. Not long before we arrived, several southbound Iroquois traders snatched from where they'd camped alongside their canoes on the banks of the Ohio had met a similar fate. Even though I had come through Appalachia, and even though I had Ants and Hagen to translate for me, Ants doubted the brutal creatures would see the value in keeping me alive. They valued human beings but little, and whatever information they were looking to pull from us, they seemed not to trust it to the vagaries of translation. We all stood there in silence for a long, long time, milling about the room and basking in the dire nature of our situation. Perhaps an hour was spent like that, in the timeless depths of a sunless world which knows no time. But whether it was an hour or 10 minutes spent pacing and waiting for execution and listening in vain for the sounds of our captor's eventual approach, it felt far longer than either. When salvation came, it came unexpectedly, from one of the red men, who stood up and revealed himself to be a Cherokee from the Carolina Highlands, with some command of the English language. He suggested my situation wasn't hopeless. The chutes the cave things used were too slick for surface men to crawl back up them once at the bottom, so the entrance to our makeshift prison wasn't an option. But there was a chute along the far wall of the chamber in which we stood, hidden amidst a forest of low stalagmite fangs thrust up from the floor, directly across from the one we'd been slid down to get here. This opposing chute went straight down into blackness, and was used as a sort of trash dump by our captors, who threw food scraps and the corpses of men they killed down it when they'd finished with them. There was a deep body of water down there, the Cherokee knew, for whenever the cave things used the trash chute, the echo of impacted water and its splashing aftermath rang back up the passage to him. Hagen protested, insisting we couldn't know how far the drop was from here, and how deep the water was. Moreover, there was no way to know whether there would be a navigable exit, or whether I'd be able to find my way out in the dark. But the Cherokee countered that any chance of survival, however slim, was better than none to those with something to live for, and Ants nodded solemn agreement. I weighed my options, but I didn't linger. Our captors were, Ants said, likely supping and sleeping briefly above us, and would be down to see to their 2 new prizes before long. As I saw it, to stay was to agree to a certain execution, and as much terror as the prospect of delving alone into the unknown below dredged up in me, the same foolhardy, pugnacious desire for challenge and adventure demanded I try to last as long as I could, and do everything in my power to see the sun again. Perhaps, had I known what awaited me, I would not have gone. I might have made peace with my Creator and awaited whatever was in store for me, a quick death rather than a lingering nightmare. But even now, riding with all the awful experience I've accrued, I cannot blame myself for risking the jump into the unknown. I did what I felt I had to do. I told my friends in no uncertain terms that I was going, and Ants and Hagen said their goodbyes, and assured me they'd say they hadn't seen me jump, and knew nothing of my whereabouts. Hagen gave me his mostly intact boots, as I'd lost one of mine on the way down, and the other was sorely torn. He also gave me a small morsel of jerky and a brick of pemmican, being assured by his cousin that our captors would eventually feed them, and that I needed the food more than they. Ants gave me a battered but durable hide jacket he'd worn on the night of his capture, telling me it would prove useful against the jagged edges and keen tips of unforgiving stone down there. The spare powder horn Ants carried was still hidden in its sheath within the garment, and when I made to return it, he told me it might serve me better than him. Finally, one of the Indians, who spoke no English and whose nation and name I did not learn, gave me 2 of the small candles the group had been allowed by the cave things, along with a flint shard and the broken end of a rusting knife for use as a striker, with which to light these candles, or perhaps some larger fire, lower in the caverns. Those final tokens were the most vital, and to this day it disturbs me that I will never know the title, or even the country, of the man who gave them to me. I wrapped all these precious things, along with my filthy trousers and stockings, in Ance's jacket, hoping the water-resistant material would help act as a float for the things until I got my bearings in the blackness, and perhaps keep them from being soaked through into the bargain. I shook hands with Ance and Hagen, looked longingly at the sputtering pinprick of light by which we'd been blessed with sight after so long in the dark, and then approached the trash chute, trying to steel myself to leave it all behind. It was oval in shape, and for the most part had sides as smooth as the one down which we'd entered the prison. It was significantly wider than a man, and though I knew it must remain wide enough to allow its contents to crash into the unseen water below, I had time on the edge to pray that the sides didn't narrow on the way down, and that the fall would be clean. I lingered, listening to the distant and barely perceptible drip of water somewhere deep down there in the bowels of the earth. Then I jumped.